We're live.
Ooh.
Wicked. Brrr, Tara, Dr. Tara Mokhtari.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a long time.
I know.
Almost a decade.
That's crazy. It's crazy to think I left Melbourne like 8 years ago now, pretty much.
A long time. A lot can happen in 8 years.
A lot can happen in 8 seconds.
This is true. Have you ever written a piece that took you 8 seconds to write? Thank you note, maybe.
I'm thinking haikus, maybe. No, definitely. Maybe 8 minutes, possibly, but not 8 seconds.
Nothing published.
No, certainly not. Maybe even, I don't even think it would take me longer than 8 seconds to write a title for a poem.
I think lots of people would deliberate for a lot longer than 8 minutes over a title for a poem.
Right. 8 years.
I often just like scan my poem for something that pops out.
Mm-hmm.
I just go, oh, that works. Yeah. Or something that is close.
Yeah, that works. That's the nice way to do it. So maybe you do only take 8 seconds.
To title it, yes. We were just talking about communications. So did you and your colleague, it's your colleague you mentioned, right?
Yeah.
Did you and your colleague come to any understanding after that brief encounter about communication?
No, I mean, we agreed that we just, that we just don't know, or that it's impossible to package into a comprehensive kind of definition. And then I was reminded of the conversation we had the other night. I took a car all the way home to Brooklyn from the Bronx because I finished teaching quite late, and I was exhausted, and so I let myself take a car. But I got into the car, and the driver said, "Are you a student here?" They always think I'm a student. I mean, still, which is amazing. I'm 34 now. I've been teaching for 11 years. And I'm really grateful every time that happens, because I know that the time will come when I'm old and haggard and no one will confuse me for a student. But so I said, "No, I teach." And he said, "Oh, what do you teach?" And I said, "Communication arts." And he said, "Oh, what is communication?" Oh, no, he said, what occupation will that lead to? What kind of job? And I was like, I guess you could become a professor of communication. But in reality, my students are from the nursing discipline. They're doing criminal justice. They're doing business. They're doing, film, TV, radio, theatre. And, what it comes down to, I guess, is it's one of those, to me, communication arts is one of the rare kind of disciplines that you can learn, at the college level, where you're being taught how to think critically about things that are pertinent to your daily existence. And, we depend on communication to formulate an identity, and to feel connected and to just have our basic needs met, to feed ourselves, to, so sometimes it sort of feels like I'm just teaching people how to be people, which is dumb.
It's I was going to say it's kind of niche, and then you started talking more, and then you continued talking, and it's like, well, it's kind of broad. It's like you've niched it. You can become a professor, but you can also apply it to pretty much every single area that you can think of.
Exactly.
And I was just imagining that, is there somebody at these places, whether it's the person who's a nurse and they're senior, or whether it's whether it is the I can't recall what some of the professions you just mentioned. The
business,
the other occupations. Is there somebody who's a senior who suggests, hey, maybe you should go do communications arts, or maybe you should go learn communication? like what would be the motivation for somebody to come and sign up to to come learn from you, to come learn this course?
Well, incredibly, actually, one of the stresses of my job, my specific job, is that the nursing students are required to get, I think it's like a B average in communications to even be allowed to specialize in nursing, because it's such a sort of integral part of their daily life if they go on to become a nurse. And so if they don't do well in communications, they have to keep retaking it until they do well, which is, kind of weird but wonderful. And then I think about my students in criminal justice, and I think about, if every cop had to go to college and take a communications class in the United States.
Mandatory.
It really, maybe it should be, really.
Is there any that kind of thing happening? Is there any push for that kind of thing? Any lobbying or?
Not that I'm aware of. I know that it's that in the Bronx where I teach, that everyone who does criminal justice, I think, has to take communications, but there are lots of different career paths in that specialty, and to become a cop, you don't necessarily have to go to college, I don't think, or maybe you do, I don't know, but maybe you just go to cop school where they don't teach you how to communicate at all.
They teach you how to command.
Yeah, and how to be commanded, and how to, I know.
Have you had any altercations, any interactions with police, with law enforcement while you've been over there?
No. I have a funny story about a friend who did. My friend Anya, she's one of my best friends. She was quite drunk a few years ago in...
I love this story already. Like how drunk are we talking? Are we talking like, you said quite drunk? Are we talking like she doesn't know if I'm drunk? Like she can't remember
I'll let
drunk?
You be the judge.
Okay.
That. So she was in Washington Square Park, and she noticed that there was a police horse that was unattended. I think the actual policeman was, maybe a few feet away.
Or? I
don't know. And she decided to try to get up onto the horse.
To mount said horse.
Yeah, she tried to mount it. And then after a few minutes, the police officer came up to her, and of course, because she's a very sweet, small,
attractive,
white woman, he sort of calmly led her, took her hand and led her off the horse and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, do you realize that you're trying to mount a police officer?" Because, the police horses are known as officers as well, apparently.
Right.
And,
so she was not that drunk that she didn't remember the words that were spoken.
Yeah, well, that's
kind of hard. And she didn't come off either. So
no, that's true. So she didn't fall off the horse.
So she was reasonably drunk.
Yeah. Just
Amazing.
The right amount of drunk for that to happen.
That sounds perfect. That sounds like the kind of the levels of drunk you want to be when you come back to school. Not unless you're African American or Mexican.
In which case, leave the horse alone, I guess.
Do not mount the officer.
Do not mount the officer. Absolutely not.
What was I'm trying to link it back, like what can we learn about communication in that interaction?
I don't know, but I feel like we could link that back to 8-second poetry for sure.
Definitely.
There's definitely a haiku in that.
The haiku. What is a haiku? I know everyone knows what a haiku is, but for those 3 people in the world that do not, can you quickly just touch on what a haiku is and what's your interest in them?
So a haiku is a poem of 3 lines that originated in Japan. It's actually a very ancient style. And the poem is divided in terms of on or or which sort of loosely translates in English to syllables. It's a kind of sound. And so I think you have 5 on in the first line, 7 on in the second line, and 5 on in the third line, except that, that's a kind of a loose rule. And really the point of a haiku is to give the reader a unique sense of understanding an object or a setting or the subject.
As in like a different point of view, of a way of looking at whatever is the subject of the haiku itself.
Exactly. So you would rearrange the lines in a way that presents the subject in sort of an unexpected light. That's sort of the point of a haiku.
So it's kind of like a limerick.
Yeah. Well, kind of, except limericks are much longer.
Yeah.
But yeah.
In terms of I'm just imagining when you said that, I'm like, well, I imagine like a good haiku or something that's like memorable or something that you feel or you actually succeeds in its mission of trying to give you a different perspective would have a kind of a twist at the end, or a surprising ending, or some play on words, or
absolutely, yeah. I mean, yeah, it can be.
Do you have any examples? Do you have an example of a shit haiku and a really awesome haiku?
So yeah, I can find you my favorite haiku. I don't want to mess it up.
Here's one I prepared earlier. Dr. Google got your back.
Dr. Google. So this haiku is called Blowing Stones, and it's by
glowing or blowing, or like glowing like it's radiant.
Blowing like.
Okay. Hey guys, I'm Sarah Bendrick, and I'm here with Wayfair to show you guys how to make this awesome indoor hanging herb.
That is a terrible haiku. That's an example of a terrible haiku. It doesn't even have the right amount of syllables.
I'm sorry. This ad popped up and messed me up.
Pesky pop-ups. Fucking pop-ups.
I know. Why does that still happen?
Ad block.
I really don't understand. Okay, so the poem is Blowing Stones by Matsubasho, and it's simply blowing stones along the road on Mount Asama, the autumn wind.
Boom. Done.
Yeah.
Done. So it's just painting a picture. That's quite vivid.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's funny you should say that, because the Imagists were really inspired a lot by the haiku for that reason, because, of that. So the Imagist movement was around about a little over 100 years ago, and the Imagists believed that poetry should do what no other art form can do, which is to sort of elicit an emotional and an intellectual understanding of the subject at the same time. So you can sort of feel the poem and understand it in one experience of the poem.
One fell swoop.
Yeah, exactly. One fell swoop. And so, so the idea of painting a picture is very apt.
And awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Is there an example of a terrible haiku now?
You can find at least 2 in my book of poetry.
And are there like haiku masters who just write them their whole life and become good eventually, or is it the kind of thing that anyone can be great at?
I mean, it's a really intense kind of art form. I mean, Matsubasho would, voyage around Japan and write constantly, and he would keep track of his travels and what he saw and who he met, and just striking images of his travels and his experiences through haiku, through writing So it's a way that can be a way of experiencing the world. I guess that's one way to master it.
I imagine that because it's got the limitations. So I'm sure this is probably discussed endlessly within people who know anything about haikus and poetry. But I'm a newbie in terms of haikus. I've heard of them. I think I've written a few, maybe handful, terrible ones, obviously. And I just imagine that there's something to do with the limitations. What the first thought I had was that they probably fucks it up when you translate it from Japanese to English, was my first thought. Fucks up the syllable length. And what happens there, like with the translation, first and foremost, I'll stick with this one as it was my first thought. So what happens when it is a different syllable length, and does it change into English, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's historically the challenge of trying to translate any kind of poetry, is that form is so important, and every language has its own, unique features and language is really deeply connected with culture as well, and the way our very understanding of the world often occurs through language. That's why, if you ask anyone who's bilingual, if, there are times when they have an experience, in an English-speaking country and they have a word for it in another language, but there's no word for it in English, that's part of the way that we understand the world through language. And that's essential to poetry, and it makes it really, really hard to translate. I'm actually doing that in the process of starting this huge translation project with my mom, where our goal is to translate all of Hafez's ghazals from the Farsi to English. And my mother, who's sort of a Hafez expert, I really had to kind of convince her that this was a good idea. She really felt like it's going to be impossible. So we've been kind of scratching away, trying to figure out if it can be done. And it has been done a lot of times, and most of that, and people put a huge amount of work into trying to get it right, and very few people get it.
And then they still butcher it.
Yeah, and it's, because it's hard, not because they're lacking in skill or whatever, but it's just a really difficult thing to do.
So you didn't want to just write a book of 100 haikus or something, like keep it simple?
Okay, keep it simple. I think it's a really important undertaking. I think especially in light of how all the misconceptions that there are around Iranians and Iranian culture. People confuse politics for culture a lot, and
talk to us more about that. What are these confusions that you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, there's just very little knowledge about Middle Eastern culture in America and in Australia. People just see what's on the news. They hear Middle East and they think terrorism, and
you probably get that a lot over there, especially.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'm kind of a white racist worst nightmare, because in America I found, because people sort of see me, or white people tend to look at me and think,
they just assume you're a white girl.
Well, they sort of, no, actually, surprisingly, they kind of know that I'm other. They think I might be half something, or that I'm Asian or something like that. Or I get, that maybe I'm Latina. I get that a lot.
Hey, mommy.
Yeah.
They hollering at you on the street.
Exactly.
Hooting and hollering.
And then they hear my accent and they think, oh, she must be English, or maybe sometimes they think Australian. And then and then so they feel safe, and then they say, so where are you from, expecting me to say England or Australia, and I say, you know, I was born and raised in Australia, but I'm Persian, I'm Iranian. And they just sort of,
you just see their head explode. You see their head explode.
From their
it's like, I liked you. I liked you a second ago.
Exactly. Yeah.
Why you got to do that to me?
It's fascinating, and it's a really great way to you know, if a man is trying to pick me up in a bar, it's a really good way to sort of end a conversation short, I found, which is, it's great.
This date is going terribly, by the way. So you hold that card, you hold that one up your sleeve. You don't tell them until it gets bad. And if it doesn't go bad, you not tell them. You keep that to yourself.
I mean, it's, if I'm on a date with the person, if it's gotten to that point, then hopefully they already know. But it's just, you know.
That's incredible that it's like that. It's what would be the percentage, would you say? Like, if you met 100 people, how many would have that kind of a reaction? Well, would it matter with race? If you met 100 like Mexicans, would that change with 100 Dominicans, with 100, you know, Albanians, with 100 like white Americans, Black Americans? Would that all change?
That's a really interesting question. I think, I mean, largely I've noticed that the trend seems to be that Black people tend to think that I'm white, and white people tend to think that I'm sort of, you know, like unknown, or
in the other category.
Yeah, and so they know that I'm not like, you know, white European, but they don't necessarily know why or how they came to that conclusion. And in fact, you know, I had this weird experience when I was visiting my parents in Sydney a couple of years ago. My mother had this, she threw a little party and some of her friends came, and one of her friends who I'd never met before walked in through the door. And as I was coming down the stairs, she walked up and she said in Persian, she said, is this your daughter-in-law?
That didn't sound very Persian.
No, sorry. It wasn't Persian. And which means, is this your daughter-in-law? Thinking that I wouldn't understand. And my sister-in-law, who she was referring to, is Japanese. And I got really upset. Not because she confused me for being Japanese, but because, you know, I get confused for being something other than what I am by everybody else. So I was hoping, I would hope that at least Persians, especially in the context of being in my own mother's house, wouldn't confuse me for anything other than Persian. It was just like, it sort of broke my heart a bit. And
close to home.
Yeah.
Close to home.
Yeah.
That's interesting to have that, to have that kind of importance, that would affect you so much that it affects you like that, you know, to hold that, wow, it's like almost like a displacement or an outcast. It's like it's covert or not even intentional a lot of the time, but like, you know, displacement or, you know, being outcast or, and just to have that awareness and that empathy, I guess that sensitivity to it, you know, because for me, you know, where am I from? I'm from all over the place as well. And it's just like, yeah, it probably happens all the time, but I'm like, because it's kind of a mix. I think I just do something in my brain where it's just like, it's like water off a duck's back in a way. But if I really look at it and go, yeah, that is probably hurtful, if I really paid attention to it and really were like, felt that inside, I'm like, that's actually hurtful, but I try not to take offense. You know, people ask me all the time, have you experienced racism in Australia? I'm like, all the time, but I don't kind of pay attention to it. I don't kind of give it fuel or whatever. And because I'm from all the different places as well, you know, born in Jamaica, I got a Kiwi mother with she's got an Indian father, lived in Australia my whole life, or most of my life. And so it's like, where are you from? All over the place. And so it's like, I don't have the situation where you have, where I have a Persian person, like a Jamaican, like nobody's my mix. So I can't have that situation what you had, you know, because it's like, I would expect them. No, I wouldn't expect them to know either, because it's like, you're like in my own house. It's like, where's this person? Or is that you're not related to them? Or, you know, I can't actually relate to that because of my experience. But it is an interesting thing, this racism. And I feel that it's almost, for me, it's so stupid. It's ridiculous. You know what I mean? But in a lot of these places, especially I've got friends in like Denmark, in Egypt, and they say it's like, it's terrible. Or even you go to Jamaica, the racism against anyone who's not, or anyone who's a foreigner. You go to Mexico, anyone who's gringo or from other is so ripe, and it's ridiculous. But it's interesting how we have that that response to things that are different to us. You know, it's really fascinating just looking at that phenomenon, you know. And is that something that you like to touch on yourself with, in terms of poetry, or in terms of when you're teaching communication and things like this? Or
yeah, I mean, I teach intercultural communication. That's part of my discipline, certainly. And I guess
I've just got this vision in my head of people slowing down to speak to the person from the other country, and you teaching how to do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, sometimes you have to. One of the things that I teach actually is this idea that you have to be okay with some degree of like disclarity. Like, you have to be okay with coming away from a conversation not having understood absolutely everything in the same way that you would, and that you have to be all right with that sort of ambiguity.
Is that a kind of a natural human tendency to want to have that clarity?
Yeah, and I think people get frustrated and then they will blame the other person when they can't understand something. I think that's, you know, and then that's not productive. I mean, yeah, but you know, like I have felt, I mean, one of the reasons why I feel so at home in New York, I think, is because there is a level of diversity and a level of kind of openness here that doesn't exist in the, you know, most of the rest of the United States. New York is kind of its own weird little bubble of, and there are, you know, huge problems with racism here as well. But the diversity here is so great that you have to really confront it constantly, and you can't get away with, I think, what we do in Australia, which is to sort of decorate everything as a joke and to assume that it's all right for a white person to say, you know, racially horrific things as long as it's sort of dressed up in like as entertainment or as like just joking around with mates or whatever that is. Like, I don't know, there's this real sweeping under the rug that happens in Australia with racism, and because, you know, I don't know what it is, but yeah, it freaks me out, and I feel like I couldn't live there again, you know.
With the casualness, the casual racism, you know, it's just like,
right, and then like, yeah, but then like casual racism is shrugged off as casual.
That's what I mean. Like the fact there is a casual racism is
right, and it comes from a really deep-seated place of like hatred, in fact, and it's really troubling to me. Is
there cases like, what's this, like a successful, like success stories of, you know, having that understanding, or like people not being frustrated because they've learnt into cultural communication on a individual scale? I imagine it happens all the time, but is there specific cases that you can cite where there's been a big disagreement or misunderstanding between nations or between this side and that side, and and that illustrates having an increased level, better level of higher level of communication interculturally, especially, that has actually resolved things or actually made someone understand each other, made two people understand each other more, or two sides, or more than two sides, multiple sides. Is there any kind of success stories or any kind of things that you can think of, cases you can think of that illustrate that?
I mean, we're such a globalized, society in a lot of ways, that now, it's possible for someone to, who was born and raised in Australia, to move to, say, Japan and live there for the rest of their lives, and go through, some of the problems of being perhaps a white person living in Japan and being left out of situations in business and stuff like that, which happens to foreigners quite often. But the mere fact, I think, that it's possible that immigration and some degree of assimilation, at least to the point of being able to function productively in society, has a lot, there's a lot to say for that in terms of intercultural communication. Having said that, there are also huge, obstacles, and it can be very difficult. And, my family are immigrants. I'm kind of almost a double immigrant in a weird way. And
an immigrant to where you're from, do you mean?
Yeah, well, I am an immigrant in the US, and then I'm a child of immigrants from Iran to Australia. And I know, from my own experience, even having the advantages of having English as, one of my first languages, and also, growing up in Western society and all that kind of stuff, as an immigrant, you're starting fresh, you start kind of at zero, and there are certain perceptions about you, and you don't have any credit rating, and and people don't trust you initially, and you kind of have to start at zero and work triple time, to build up a level of functionality that's really hard.
Yeah, and that's the reality of what's happening at the moment, isn't it? And it's interesting that, because a lot of the locals will take it for granted, take these opportunities, take these things for granted, and then especially out here, if you got people saying these bloody people taking the jobs, this and that, it's like, well, they're going to work 3 times harder than you. they're gonna make 4 times less than you wherever they've traveled from. So it's like, it's an interesting thing to have that racism, or like that. I can't think of the right word. It's just like, what is the right word? It is
ethnocentrism.
Well, it's more the entitlement, I think, is the word I'm looking for.
Right.
It's like the sense of entitlement, which it comes across as racism. Totally, it's like patriotism as well. People can kind of blend these things as well. And again, do you touch on this in any of you write poetry? I'm not making that up, right? So do you touch on any of these things in your poetry, or in some of the work that you do? And if so, how do you approach it?
In my poetry, not so much. There is politics in my poetry, just by sheer, because it's my perspective. And so the subjectivity of my perspective kind of makes my poetry political in a sense, or could be taken as social commentary, definitely. But
because of the content, did you say?
No, just because I wrote it, just because it's my perspective. Yeah. But no, mostly my poetry is about it's about the everyday, and it's about beauty, I guess.
So it's more the Japanese haiku, observing what's happening around you and painting the pictures beautifully with the words.
Right.
Giving a perspective.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's the goal.
Cool. And with just touching on the Australia thing, like you personally would never move back to Australia, right? You've made that decision. And is there any specific places that you've been all around and tried to find the spot, or is this just major cities, or like, yeah, what's the thing that's keeping you away personally from there? From here, sorry.
I could never get used to turning on the TV and seeing all white people again. Like I could never get used to that again. And when I'm there and that happens, I kind of, like I'll turn on and the project is on, and it's kind of like Wonder Bread personified, and it's weird to me, and I can't.
Most people just say it's the internet. It's slow internet.
Yeah.
That's like the one thing.
Yeah, the internet sucks too. But no, it's more just I felt kind of alien there in a weird way, and I tried real hard not to feel alien for 27 years, and it didn't work.
So that's just the personal thing. So I'm curious to why that is for you. Obviously, you've had your personal experience and you feel alien. And I'm also curious to, like, who would you recommend to live in Australia? Someone who is, what kind of person would you say would love Australia?
There are a lot of, anyone who needs good healthcare should move to Australia. Anyone who's sick should move to Australia, definitely.
All the sick people. Get over there. Send us the sick folk.
Exactly, yeah.
And beach lovers for sure. There's plenty of ocean here.
Anyone who needs to survive, yeah, you're right.
Survivalists, yeah, that's another good one. Anyone who likes rugged terrain.
Yeah. I don't know. People tell me that it's on their bucket list to go to Australia, and I'm like, why?
I'm curious to know how many people you're single-handedly responsible for deterring from Australia. Is it in the thousands?
Driving a little campaign over here. It's funny, like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't think I do. I don't think I'm successful at it. And it is a beautiful place to visit, but even just as an artist, I found it really hard to be there, as a writer, and especially as a poet. I felt extremely limited in ways that are, I got really lucky. I had my first book published by an Australian publisher, the fabulous Finlay Lloyd, published my first book, Anxiety Soup.
Is that their name, the fabulous Finlay Lloyd, or is that your edition? Yeah,
it's called Finlay Lloyd, but I think they're pretty fabulous.
Yeah.
Not biased at all, but that felt like a fluke to me. And then my only other option seemed to be, it's hard to be a poet in the world in 2017 anyway.
What makes it so hard? Is just there's so many, or you get lost in the sea of all the social media, and why is it so difficult?
Because poets aren't regarded the same way that they once were, because people don't read poetry anymore.
Is that because of population, or is it just because there's so many people now, or because the poets at some stage lost its reverence, or what's the reason, do you feel?
I think cultural values just shifted, and whereas once people looked to poetry as a placeholder for religion even.
How long ago was that? Because you were talking about the Imagists, was it? Was that the term you used?
Yeah, it was before the Imagists, I think during the Enlightenment, that sort of became, literature became part of your spiritual well-being.
So what year are we talking? How long ago was this?
You know, when was the Enlightenment? A couple hundred years ago.
Cool. So recent, quite recently.
Yeah, fairly recently. But I mean, well, not that recently. I don't know. Depends on your
10 generations. Yeah.
Yeah.
What,
then you have.
Go on.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you. So, what do you feel it takes? You said it's difficult to be a poet in this day and age. You know, I can't name that many. You know, I've got a bunch of friends who are poets. They're spoken words. They'd written poetry. We had Aaron Lux on one of the podcast episodes. Beautiful poet. Yeah, a great friend of mine, and we've got friends like Luca Lesson who does the spoken word stuff. Lisi Malay, a whole bunch of my friend Bravo Child was on the show. He's also a poet. These kind of slam poets and stuff is kind of there's a lot of them. Saul Williams is another name I know. I don't know that many, but what do you feel it takes? Like, what is it about these people who become names that, I remember? Obviously me, I'm into music, I'm into poetry myself a little bit, like I can name 5 names or whatever I did just then. But what do you feel it takes for somebody to actually reach that level where they're recognized? And is it just the grit determination, the sheer determination of them, or is it, what do you feel it is?
Well, first of all, I kind of struggle with slam poetry, which makes me super unpopular in Australia, especially.
How do you mean you struggle with it? Because I can totally relate to that, by the way.
Because slam poetry it's really, it's written for performance. And to me, poetry needs to be as fluent on the page without any of the bravado or performance or the visual personality of the poet, determining what the poem is about. And
so in terms of that, do you feel that it kind of waters it down in a way, or it takes out a bit of the essence, or a lot of the essence? Or
yeah, I mean, I think it's an art form in itself, but to me it's different from actual poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, and I struggle with, and I'm not a performer, I never have been, and so just,
what about when you combine the two? I imagine some people, if you got some traditional, how you call it, like, I don't know, organic poetry, I don't know what the right word is, poetry you might call it, and you had some of that and unadulterated, pure, whatever you want to call it, poetry, and it's nice no matter if you're 5-year-old, if you're 80-year-old, if you're wherever you're from, whatever culture you're from, and it is beautiful. You just know it's beautiful because it makes you feel, and you have it's got the meter, it's got all the visual, it's got everything that makes a good poem. I'm just saying words that are poetry related. I know nothing. And I imagine, what if you combine them and then threw that over to some slam poem, and would they make it like, would that take it into the super poem territory? Or
yeah, I'm not into it. I'm really, I can't get on board with it because to me, one of the beautiful things about poetry is that it's difficult. Is that it's actually, you might do a first reading of a poem and just feel lost, and that's okay. And then you read it again, and then you look at each line individually and you start to interpret it, and then new things, new elements keep coming through each reading, and you have to think about it. And when you go to bed at night, you lie awake thinking, what the fuck did I just read? Excuse me. And that, to me, poetry is supposed to make you think, not merely entertain you. And so it makes me sad when all of the weight is put on how entertaining was it, how impressive was it, how shiny was it, how much do you want to be that slam poet who's getting all the clicks right now? Like, to me, that's that.
Sorry, I've lost you for a moment. Hold on a sec.
what.
Oh, I got as far as getting all the clicks. So go again from there. Sorry.
Yeah. So so poetry that's getting all the clicks. What was I saying? Because it's you know, it's entertaining, and it's just impressive, and because you want to be like that slam poet, and there's a lot of ego involved, and it's just about, it's the same as going to, like, watching, you know, an episode of Grey's Anatomy or something all of a sudden, and there's no you don't have to think about it. It's, everything is popping right in front of you. It's like a fireworks show, and that's not it's not what's beautiful about poetry to me. To me, the beauty in poetry is the difficult stuff, the thing that, you know, the fact that it's, you know, that it makes you think in new ways, I guess.
And that you feel is the purpose and the meaning of it underlying is to get you thinking in new ways, like we begun at the top with the haiku, is to represent things in a way that you'd never looked at things before, to increase the, I guess, this kind of, I'm imagining like a sphere of mind and like expanding. So to expand ourselves and our being, essentially. And you feel that that is completely lost, like even if you're an amazing slam poet or performance poet, you feel that like, I feel that a really good slam poet will happen. You'll go back and visit and it will make new things pop. And I don't know if it's lost completely.
Right. No, I think there are a few really incredible performance poets. I mean, first of all, then my other problem with slam poetry is I find it very strange, the whole idea of competitive arts. That has always freaked me out. And not just in slam, but I don't enter competitions, and I find that whole thing.
Aren't you a teacher?
Yeah.
Are we competing for like against ourselves to get a good grade, or?
Oh, against ourselves, sure. But to pit artists against each other, just, you know, I find that a very strange thing, and it happens all the time in our culture. Because
like what do you call talent quests and talent shows?
Yeah,
and stuff
talent quests. Even like trying to apply for grants as an artist is difficult. I mean, at least with that, there's really sort of specific criteria that you have to meet. It's more about meeting the maximum number of criteria than actually competing. And for popularity, I find that very odd. But what were we talking about before I started complaining again?
we were talking about slam poetry and I was trying to understand how to, or why that the poetry has gone from this, you know, the poet has gone from this revered archetype to this lost in the sea of it's not that important anymore. Is it because of I know there's probably many factors, but I'm just trying to discuss this and riff on this with you. Is it because maybe I'm just going to throw things out there, throw things on the wall, see if something sticks, and like just the media, like the mass media, and the fact that there's so many words being shot at us, there's these newsreels, there's all these messages being sent, and like everyone can write. We can just write a post on our wall, and you know, it just gets lost. And the poet, anyone can be a poet. And I'm going to touch on that because a couple of the really good poets that I mentioned, that they do post stuff online as well, like on the Instagrams and stuff, but also write books. I guess what other factors do you feel are has given rise to the fall of the poet?
You're like writing poetry as you're talking, which I love. What has given rise to the fall? So this idea that you read something in order to understand something new or in a different way is dying. And it's definitely with the onset of this idea of content. It used to be that there was a relationship between the writer, the text, and the reader, which was really unique. And the reader had to do a lot of work in order to understand the writer's vision for the text.
What kind of work? Like go and collect the newspaper, or what do you mean?
You had to sit down and read. You know, you had to read a whole book, and then maybe you had to read parts of it again, and then you had to make sense of it and think about it. And I mean, there's a whole, there's a whole discipline that's called hermeneutics, which is about the relationship between the author, the text, and the reader. And historically, the reader was supposed to do, a lot of work in order to engage with the text. But now, with the onset of, marketing and advertising and, making money from literature, really, what's happening now is that you've got concepts like, SEO, search engine optimization, and content is written specifically with all of the readers' predispositions in mind. So
say that again, sorry, you just broke up. With the readers what in mind?
With all of the readers' predispositions in mind. So
everything, like it's getting psychological.
Exactly, yeah. So all of their understandings of the world are packaged up and neatly represented in, a 2-minute read or a 4-minute read, usually to sort of sell a product or an idea. And so the reader no longer has to do any work. The work's already been done. I mean, that piece of content was created just to make them feel really good for 2 minutes, or just to make them, want to keep buying the thing that they're already buying, or just to give them, give more credence to their pre-existing views on, political issues or whatever it happens to be. The reader doesn't have to do work anymore. And so that's kind of the opposite of what poetry is about, I mean, to me, which is really to do the work, that it's supposed to be hard, that you're not supposed to necessarily enjoy it straight away, that it's a discipline, and that's okay, and in fact it's good for you, I would hope.
Yeah. Do you like jazz music? Are you a jazz?
Yeah.
I imagine you'd be a fan of this technical jazz that you cannot understand.
Yeah, right. But then what happens with jazz is, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, if you're not so into it, that, if you stop stressing about how much you don't understand it, if you just relax and let it do what it's doing and wash over you, it can be.
I love jazz music personally. I've got you paused for a minute. What's going on here? All right, we're back. Yeah, personally, I love jazz music. I don't understand a lot of it. I think a lot of it's technical because I don't really play an instrument, but I just love seeing masters at work. A master at work on anything, whether they're on a football field, whether they're typing up copywriting, whether they're writing poetry, whether they're riding a horse, whether they're painting a house. A master's at work, there's something I absolutely love about watching a master at work, and that's what I love about that really technical jazz music. And that's poetry with instruments, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
And yeah, I get what you're saying. It is things. It's almost like this cookie cutter or this kind of McDonald's fast food type scenario or phenomenon that's happening with these ancient arts, with these ancient art forms, especially language and communication, which you're saying, which were quite powerful. So all of that, definitely, I can see that adding up to the fall of the poet and the communicator, essentially, isn't it? The poet is the communicator, and I do like the fact, like my homeboy Aaron Lalux, he only prints books. He doesn't do the online thing. So if you do have to do the work, you have to find him, you have to order the book. He will give it away for free a lot of the time, but you do have to find and read the actual physical book. I do. There's something about that. Even myself, I love physical, tangible books. Like I like the ebook or the digital. I like to have the book in my hand. It's definitely, I like doing that work. And it's interesting to think that at some point, like there's kids who would never have touched a book because they've got their Kindles and their tablets. And, like we're lucky enough that I imagine you would have libraries with real physical books at school that you could just sit in all day, which I did, and just read and read and read and read. Funnily enough, I didn't read much poetry as a child, but that's also funnily enough that I also wrote a poem for one of my first English assignments. Was a poem. So funny that I didn't read any, but I managed to write one.
Interesting.
Where can people access good poetry? Who are some good poets? Could you recommend some? Because I feel that you're like an advocate of poetry. So where can we find some poetry that isn't McDonald's version? Or let's not go that. Let's not isn't McDonald's version. Let's go that is 5-star delicious deluxe.
5-star delicious.
High quality poetry.
I have lots of favorite poets. Most of whom are dead. I love.
That's why there's no poets anymore. They're all dead.
Because they died.
Do they have students? Do they have students that they teach? And is it like a disciple teacher kind of?
Yeah, I imagine so. Yeah.
So you can have like lineages of poets and stuff.
You can have, absolutely.
Yeah, like is there like the descendant of Hafiz, and is there the descendant of Rumi and this type of thing, or?
Yeah, I mean they had lots of pupils, and yeah, absolutely. And all over the world that used to be the case, and even in like American poetry, you had like Walt Whitman was responsible really for introducing the American English poem, because up until Walt Whitman wrote Leaves of Grass, American poetry was written in the same cadence as poetry that was written with an English accent in mind. And then Walt Whitman took American English and the natural rhythms of American English and composed Leaves of Grass, and he used the King James version of the Bible. He used the long line sort of structure of the Bible, which is kind of fascinating. And then then you had the beat poets of the 50s and 60s and 70s who really looked up to Walt Whitman, and they kind of considered him to be like the godfather of their form. And if you read Allen Ginsberg's poem, you'll notice of long line structure, and a lot of, for many years he used a long line structure that he drew from Walt Whitman, who drew from the Bible, and so you've got definitely lineages in poetry, sure.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And do you imagine that if these poets were alive today, do you feel that they would be any good at copywriting?
Yeah, they would probably kill themselves first.
I imagine that you would be quite good at copywriting, not knowing as much as you know about it.
I've done a lot of that stuff, which is, yeah.
And what is the secret, I guess? What is the key ingredient to, again, I'll come back to that question. So in terms of modern poets, like poets that are alive, maybe even poets that are under 40 or under 50, what is the key that helps them stand out in the sea of noise that is happening in this day and age?
To be as loud as possible, really. I mean, to get followers on Instagram seems to be the way. So the same way that Kim Kardashian makes herself successful, a poet can use the same.
So it's just distribution.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
And
I love Kardashian, by the way, but yeah.
No disrespect to Kim. She's a poet in her own right. Poet of what would you call it? Poet of attention. Yeah.
I don't know. She's
businesswoman.
I'm actually
businesswoman, right?
She is a businesswoman. I'm actually, I find her that kind of fascinating. But I don't know if I'd call her a poet exactly.
Well,
but she's a work of art, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if we touched on the reasons. I'm sure we've talked about poetry, and we've dropped in a bunch of about poetry and why you feel it's important, and why you love it, and why you feel it's being watered down, and all this stuff. But what is the key reason that people should read poetry, and how can they find it? Like, I want to make it more accessible. Are there any websites? Are there any bookstores? Any people that distribute poetry because they're passionate about it, like you are? Or
yeah, I'm sure there are, specific distributors of poetry, but I mean, I would say to go and go out and buy an anthology, go out and buy like a Norton anthology of poetry, and just spend a year reading a poem a day, and then fold over the corners of the ones that you like, and then find those poets in your bookstore. I feel like that's sort of the way to do it.
And this is because it'll get you in touch with that aspect of yourself that will help you open your mind and grow, and maybe not be so racist or
Well, yeah, then I'm wondering like how many Black poets are actually in the Norton anthology, how many other poets of color are, and that's a huge problem as well. Internationally, in fact, poetry in English is still people still are thinking about too much about dead white men. But okay, so go and read Audre Lorde, who I love.
There we go. Drop some names for us.
I love Stevie Smith, who's a British writer. I wrote my PhD on her. She's wonderful. You mentioned Saul Williams, who's a fabulous example of someone who can do performance and write poetry for the page that is, really important and thought-provoking. Yeah.
And talk to us about what it is like, because I know tons of poets, tons and tons and tons, and I've seen tons and tons of poets, and a lot of them aren't very good. Let's be honest. So,
and why are you still calling them poets?
Like, a lot of them are doing poetry. I don't know, you know what I mean? A lot of them are doing the thing that poets do, writing words and speaking words, and let's be honest, no disrespect, but it takes tens of thousands, 20s of thousands of hours to master something, right? And
yeah,
they're giving it a shot, so they're giving it a crack. That's why I'll give them the respect. They're giving it a crack. They're putting themselves out there on the stage, on the page, whatever it might be. So I'll give them that much. But for you, because you work with poetry, you work with communication. When you're marking something, you're going to mark something a D, an E, a C. What's the difference between that and marking someone an A and A plus with distinctions, this kind of things? What makes if someone is someone who's like, man, I love this poetry thing, or I want to be a poet, but I don't feel I'm that good. I haven't put in enough hours, or like, what can help someone get to that next level to make it really pristine and schmick and nice and high grade? What are some key principles or some tips? Or
that's a good question. I mean, practice and I guess not, being willing to fail at it for a really long time, or to write really average poetry for a really long time until it stops being average, and to try different things, and to read widely, like to read outside of your comfort zone. I mean, to read it all, I think that's one of the big issues with young poets who are really into the idea of being a poet, but maybe aren't reading.
To read poetry, or just to read all types of media?
To read poetry specifically, I think. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that's important, and to talk about it. In fact,
so just to immerse yourself in it.
Yeah, to immerse yourself in, and for many years, And my other piece of advice would be, hold off on self-publishing for like 10 years. Do it for 10 years, and then if
you're like, stop putting average poetry out there, ruining the market.
Well, yeah,
if that's the bar,
I didn't say those. You said those words.
If that's, I'm telling them, you motherfuckers, stop putting average poetry out. Wait, So if the bar's here, we need to raise the bar, guys. So
yeah.
So have patience, right?
You know, you actually introduced me to a performance poet who I love. Many years ago, you showed me a video of Muta Baruka.
Ah, yes, Beast. Yes, very good.
Yeah,
very good.
Love Muta Baruka. I love Linton Kwesi Johnson.
Thousands of hours. You can just feel it. I got literally chicken skin talking about it. It's crazy.
Oh, really? Just thinking about it? Yeah.
So good.
Yeah, I love those guys.
One of my favorite, I don't know, poet, but songwriter would be what is her name? Tanya Stevens. If you know Tanya Stevens, check her out because she's amazing. She's a singer, but her songs are poems. Like they're beautiful.
Cool. I love that. Poet. It's really hard to write lyrics. It's like surprisingly, I mean, most of my friends are musicians, and I'm often asked, "Hey, do you want to collaborate? Can you write some lyrics for me?" And I've done it a few times, but it's like
it takes longer.
It's another way of thinking.
It's another part of the brain, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. It's those things that you mentioned. Just write all the time, immerse yourself, live it, become it, almost, right? That's how you're going to get better, right? Like add anything, like anything, and
completely forget your ego as well. You have to.
So, yeah, with the ego as well, I guess it's like that double-edged sword. It's like have enough ego to distribute, and if you got a good message, and like you melt the ego, and then how do we will it speak for itself? I guess, and other people will distribute it. Like, it's an interesting concept of where to include it, or these. I'd love to see that, actually. I'd love to see a movement of the rise of the poet again, and make the poet great again. The Donald Trump. I'd love to see a movement, because Trump is a good example of. I wouldn't call it poetry. I wouldn't disrespect poets.
Yeah.
But he's very good at garnering attention. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I do enjoy what he's doing. That's actually something. How do you feel? Because I was just in the States, and I have a lot of people over here and around the world who are like, America's fucked, I'm not going there, Donald Trump, this and that, especially Americans living away from America. I didn't feel any different. I didn't feel any different from before Trump. Like, how do you feel being there now that Trump is the president? Does things change? Is it noticeable?
I think we all exist in our own little bubbles, and so I certainly can't speak for all of America. I can't even speak for all of New York, but what I have noticed is a huge return to activism. I've noticed conversations rising up through the woodwork that we should have been having for the past 20 years. And people are getting out on the streets and marching, and they're not just stopping there. They are then organized. They're going back to their communities, organizing, affecting change. When the first executive order was signed for the Muslim ban back in January, I was heartbroken, obviously, for my own family. All were born in Tehran, and I have extended family who were stuck in Iran, who were supposed to be coming back. But what was incredible and what was really heartening was just the massive movement to stop it in its tracks immediately from all sides.
It was just a massive hell no. This is not happening.
Exactly. Yeah. And to the ACLU just jumping in and getting the matter in court immediately and having it turned around. The New York taxi drivers, they
banded together, did they?
Banding together, and there were people, trapped in airports, unable to leave the airport and stuff. Like, it was just this immediate response of activism that I've never seen. I mean, in my lifetime anywhere, really.
So it's lit a fire up under people's asses. He's doing a good thing. He's banding the people together. He's getting the grassroots activists out off their asses.
Absolutely,
getting
totally.
the social
And, you
justice
know, like,
warriors.
totally, yeah. And he's extremely divisive and extremely problematic, and he's given a lot of you know, power and voice to white supremacists, and which is terrifying. But the thing is, these people weren't born
Huge minority, massive minority.
Right, yeah. And these people have been there from the beginning. It's just that now we know who they are and where they are and what's going on. And so to me, that's the biggest shift that I've noticed.
Nice,
yeah.
Nice. Yeah, it's good to hear from an insider perspective, you know, someone who's been there for a good time. Cool. It's been a pleasure. I think we're going to wrap up here pretty soon. Cool. Thank you so much for your time. So good to catch up with you. It's been a pleasure.
Having me. Nice to see your face.
Yeah, likewise. We're going to continue the conversation. Obviously, we can riff on this stuff for days on end. So, and I'm sure, you'll have some there'll be some new happenings in your life and in the world before next time as well. So if you'd like to come back, I'll be more than happy to have you on.
I love that.
And awesome. And just before we go, this podcast is called Living Life in the Flow Zone. So this is a concept of living in flow, just finding the flow, finding what is that point of balance where everything seems to be running smoothly, and it's just like you're right there, you're in the present, and things are going nice. Is that an experience that you find yourself in, or in your own words, in your own experience, in your own language? And if so, how do you bring that state about? I guess that's what I'm asking.
God, that's like the challenge of living, right? Is to find that balance and to find that. I mean, the thing for me has always been because my work, I mean, as a writer, I'm an introvert naturally. Teaching takes a lot of energy for me. You know, giving lectures is exhausting. I mean, I love it, but it's really tiring for me. And I can spend 10 weeks in my room sitting behind my computer writing and not leave the house, and I would be fine doing that. That's
your flow. Right.
Well, that's one of them, right. So it's one of them, but it's not good for my body, and I don't know if it's in the long term great for my soul. So for me, the wonderful thing about teaching is that it pulls me outside of myself, and I turn my attention to the needs of other people and to look after others, and to serving my community. And so for me, that's the two
counterpoints. The counterpoints.
Yeah, exactly. And I need a balance of both. Yeah.
Beautiful. Definitely. Finding that balance is definitely the art form. So thank you for sharing that. It's a beautiful thing. Yeah, service is great. That's another reason why I do this podcast, or why I do a lot of my things, and definitely gets you out from that introvert to extroverted, out there and, you know, engaged with the world. So you're not just too one-sided and messing up that equilibrium, which it's hard to have flow unless you have balance, right?
Right.
Awesome sauce. Thank you so much. And I look forward to doing it again sometime. Have an amazing day. Is it evening, day?
It's nighttime.
Cool. Have an amazing evening.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. Until next time, guys, keep the flow growing and the growth flowing.